Let me start recording before I forget it altogether, so at least we'll have something for posterity.
Well,
Um,
I really liked having the video from y'all from last week to watch. That was very helpful.
oh, good, good. Yeah, I did remember to log that one. Well, anyway, let's get going, and we'll see what we want to cover tonight. Want to just administratively remind you that I'd like to get that first case, that Bethesda mining case, submittal in tomorrow, if at all possible. If something if you're having problems, if too many things coming down at one time, I'm not going to be real hung up about. You guys have been good about meeting commitment dates and so forth. So, if you need another day or two, so be it. Wanted to.
I have mine finished. It's just I didn't, and I was going to send it yesterday, and I thought, well, I wanted to wait until tonight to see if there were any revelations tonight that I go, oh no, I better look at that again. So it's ready to go. I just didn't was just waiting.
I have no great further insight to add. Let's put it that way. I wanted to mention, of course, that I'm going to be traveling Saturday. I'm going to be leaving early Saturday morning. I'll be joining you hopefully from California next week. And I expect to be doing this regular time slot, but I'll be doing it from beautiful downtown Bakersfield, I expect. At least that's what my schedule would suggest. Well, if it's snowing in Bakersfield, then I might even begin to believe in climate change if that were to happen. So I will be traveling this Saturday, and largely be out of communication on Saturday, and the same thing will be true a week from Sunday when I return. So get the case in. Also, I did just put an item on the weekly assignment to tell you that the midterm is posted. And what I chose to do is break the midterm into two pieces. And I did that just so that you didn't have to dedicate as big a block of time to do it, in one sitting. So there's two parts, each of which have allowable time of 2 hours, which hopefully it won't take anything close to that. But you can do them separately, but they must be done in one sitting. So the test will become available to you at noon on Saturday, and I'd like to have it done by a week from tomorrow. In other words, Friday the 21st. And again, that's now an item in the weekly assignment lineup. Wanted to make a comment on the homework problems this week from chapter 10. Somehow we got to do a little snafu in there. One of the problems didn't have its number listed, and it appeared to run together with another problem. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but there were supposed to be 10 problems in that set, and the numbers only ran till 9. That's because what should have been problem 7 was rolled into 6. So the number of points that I'm assigning to the chapter reflect 9 problems rather than 10. Some of you, what I've seen thus far, some people did problem 6 and didn't do 7, and some did 7 and didn't do 6. So whatever you did for those two, there's no penalty for having missed the fact that, because it's my fault that there was that mess up. I don't know how that happened. These homework problems this week were, of course, of a different variety. They weren't out of the text. I had some comments that maybe they were a little more difficult. Some of them maybe were, although I thought most of them would be easier than the problems in the text, but it's hard for me to judge. The one thing I want to reiterate along those lines is that, as I said before, don't struggle too long on any single homework problem or any set that you're having difficulty with. Try to contact me for some guidance and give you some direction as to how to approach the problems. I want to restate that because I really do feel strongly about that. I don't want you burning an excessive amount of time in the homework problems any more than is necessary because you can't quite figure out how to get started on something, or where did we study a formula that applies to this. So that's it. Are there any specific areas on the homework or really out of these chapters where material wasn't clear to you that you'd like to have some further discussion?
I think the one that I had on number 7 that I'm not sure what I did, but I'm going to go back and take a look at that. That was on chapter 10. That was the weird one, wasn't it?
Chapter 10, number 7.
Chapter 10, number 7.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So I've got to go back and see.
Well,
I've got lots of work that I did on my paper here. If you can see it.
yeah, if I remember right, you calculated a total.
Yeah, I got lots of crap that I wrote here, but I did, when I put it on my paper to send to you, I'm not sure what I did. So I've got to go back and try to decipher my work.
Well, well, if you can't figure it out, how the heck do you expect me to figure it anyway? The issue with that problem, and it's if it highlights an area where we need to do some backfilling, then it's good. I put the hint in there that you have to calculate the annual return for each year, and remember that the total return on an investment in a stock is going to be the combined returns coming from dividend yield, any dividends you receive, and as well as capital gains or losses. So what you really needed to do for each of those years, beginning with year 2, 3, and 4, is calculate the capital gain and add to it the dividend yield that you had. And since they're asking for geometric average returns, that was should have directed you to the fact you had to calculate the annual returns for years 2, 3, and 4 first, then apply the formula in the concept of geometric return that I think we covered before. If we need to cover that again, we can do that too. But you have to do the individual returns first.
Okay.
And then you figure out what the geometric average or geometric mean of those individual ones are. Now, I don't know if any of you have used the geomean function in Excel to calculate geometric means. It's pretty easy. It's the function is called geomean, Geomean, and what you have to do first is set up a series of cells that have the year-by-year returns, but expressed as 1 plus the return. You remember the formula for geometric mean, you take the product of 1 plus the return in year 1 times 1 plus return in year 2 and so forth. However many returns you have, you multiply those all together, and then you raise that product to the 1 over n power, with n being the number of years of data you have. So if you want to use Excel, you simply create a sequence of cells that have 1 plus the return in each year, and then in the geomean argument list, you just reference that list of cells of 1 plus r, and it will come back with the geometric mean for you. So it's pretty easy.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I was still having, I reviewed chapter 11, the first 2 again, and the third one that I was having trouble with, it's like I went back and it's like, oh, I was overthinking. I was overthinking it, and then I think I got it right. I think I figured it out. And the other two, I'm just looking at and have a paper with numbers on it, and I'm still just.
Okay, well, let's address 7 first, because I think, Betty, you did the same thing, or in the sense that the question asked for what this portfolio would do if the economy were in a boom period. And I think you jumped to calculate the expected return across the whole spectrum of possible outcomes. So, the problem was actually much simpler than the work you undertook. But in the course of doing your calculation, you did, of course, calculate what the expected return for the portfolio would be in a boom economy. That was one of the 3 that you calculated. But so I think, Maureen, you missed that reference in the statement of the problem to it being just the boom period.
No, I did know it was only the boom, but I was thrown with the dollar amounts. Because they're, it's comprised of $4,000 and $6,000.
Okay.
And then I was, I have to transfer them to decimals.
Well, you have to use those to establish the weights of the investment in each asset within the portfolio. That's all you use those for, is to establish the fact that you've got 40% invested in stock M and 60% in stock N.
Yeah, so it was the same as number 8. Essentially, that aspect of it.
Yeah, except 8, of course, gets you into the calculation of the standard deviation, which 7 doesn't require.
Right. No, I think I got that.
Okay. Well, then going back to problems 1 and 2, I think an email I sent you, I referred you to the formula that, and I didn't realize, quite frankly, that the formula for that pretty important concept is rather isn't really highlighted a lot in that chapter. Let's see, where was that?
Yeah, I just kind of did it logically because I wasn't sure how, I just logically put it together to get where I got, which I think was wrong.
Okay, well, I was looking in the wrong chapter. That's why I wasn't finding it. But it's actually the first 2 problems in that set use the equation 1115 on page 363, and what that formula is the wait a minute. I actually looking at that. That's
the beta.
Well, that's a specialized case of that. What problems 1 and 2 involve is the fact that the beta of a portfolio is simply the weighted average of the beta of the individual assets within the portfolio. So it's similar to what we were just discussing with regard to how to calculate the return on a portfolio. We use the weights times the returns on the individual assets. When it comes to calculating the beta of a portfolio made up of normally a bunch of stocks, you simply weight the individual betas of the stocks within the portfolio by the proportion of how much of the total portfolio money is invested in each one. So actually that formula, while it actually is applicable, it's being applied there specifically to reference the fact that the beta of the market portfolio is going to be 1. But Maureen, do you see that what I sent you in the email, the concept of portfolio beta being the weighted average?
I think let me get back to that. Let me pull that up. Yeah, I think I was looking at it so long that it's kind of like I have to take a break from it and then come back, and then it'll be.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. This one, again, it's a little bit won't say convoluted, but it's a little complex in that you've already got a portfolio with two assets in it, with a total investment of $400. Now you've got an additional $400 you want to invest. So you're going to end up with a portfolio potentially with four assets in it, four different assets, three stocks and the risk-free asset. And what I pointed out was that first thing you had to recognize is that the beta of the risk-free asset is 0. It's the riskless asset, therefore its beta is 0. The assumption is the risk-free asset has no correlation with the returns on the market portfolio, which means it has a 0 beta. And so now you have to say, well, how much of this additional $400 should I invest in the asset that's going to have a beta of 1.6, and how much in the risk-free asset? And so you can set that formula up for the portfolio beta being a weighted average of the betas of the four components of the portfolio. But you have to recognize that you've got $100 in A, 300 in B, and you're going to split 400 between these next two assets. I just
Right.
the heads up on that is you end up concluding that you put nothing in the risk-free asset, and you put the entire 400 in the in the asset with 1.6, and you can. Betty, you managed to get to the answer. I believe you just made a math error in
Yeah.
Is that the one?
No, I came up with the risk-free being at $100
Yeah, and I think you did that. You made that.
because I made a math error.
Yeah, so it was, you were heading in the right direction. You just when you did a little bit of a clearing of your formula or your equation, you made a small math error. So it might be easier to start working on problem 2, which again involves the beta of the portfolio, but problem 2 maybe is a little more straightforward. And if you can see your way through problem 2, then you could probably go back and try problem 1.
I think I'm close on number 2.
Okay.
I think.
Well, I can tell you, you should get, let's see, you should invest $543 approximately in stock B.
Well, I know that stock B has to, the other side of the equation has to equal 0.48, right?
0.48. Let's see.
Because I'm changing the, I'm switching the, like the 400, like dividing it by 1,000 to get it to a decimal, dividing it by 1,000 to get it to 0.40, and then multiplying it by the beta of 1.3 and getting 0.52.
Right. Okay.
So the other side, to have the portfolio with a beta of 0.9, then it would have to be,
Okay.
no, 38.
38, yeah.
38. Okay, so it would have to be 0.38. And then just getting the number in there.
Well, you got 40% times 1.3, which gives you 0.52.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, if you subtract 0.52 from 0.9, it's 0.38. Yeah.
Yeah, I should use real math, not my own, to get 0.48.
Oh, use modern math. I won't be able to follow it, but if it gets you to the correct answer.
If I use a calculator, it might help.
Yeah, and then you've got some portion of the additional $600 invested in stock A. I'm sorry, in stock B if you want a portfolio. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So
I'll be able to
well, that
take care of that.
yeah, and that one also involves, of course, the risk-free asset potentially, putting it in the portfolio, and it's got a beta of 0. So I'll be posting these solutions. I'll try to I'll have them posted by tomorrow anyway. I might even try to post them. Well, I don't want to post them tonight yet. Typically, well, let's see. There's one assignment that wasn't submitted yet, so that's what I'd be waiting for to before I post those solutions. But they'll be up there shortly. Okay. Any other questions on things, homework, or just the general material?
It was a lot to absorb.
Chapter 11.
10 and 11, especially 11.
Yeah,
Yeah.
11.
But it was, and I don't, unfortunately, I don't think the way that we do these courses allows us enough time to really absorb it. And so I think the book is, I took really good notes, and that number 7 that I did more work on, I used that as my sample when you were doing your video on instructing. I was working through that one to do all those calculations, like the example in the video, so I could, it made me stop and look at things. So I think that helped to do it that way. But it's a lot to absorb, and I know I got confused about the risk premium versus the market risk premium,
That's
terminology, and keeping them straight.
That's an important distinction. Talk about risk premiums. We probably most often talk about the market risk premium, which would mean how much above the risk-free rate is the market portfolio returning on a risk level of beta of 1. But then other times we ask for the asset risk premium. And then, if you encounter a problem, I don't even remember whether there's a problem in the exam related to this or not, but it's really important. If you see risk premium and ask you something about risk premium, look very carefully to determine whether you're being asked for the market risk premium or an asset risk premium. The latter just involves multiplying the market risk premium by the beta to give you the asset risk premium. So if a stock has has a beta of 1.5, it's going to have a risk premium expected to be 1.5 times that of the market portfolio. Regarding these chapters being kind of heavy duty, I can acknowledge that. The only thing I can say is, looking forward, I don't know if you've had a chance to get into it yet, but the next week's assignment, one of the chapters is also pretty heavy duty, but the other, chapter 15, is what I would call, certainly a less quantitative treatment, fewer formulas. It's more an overview kind of thing. So with that, and also I think the amount of homework out of chapter 15 is there's maybe only a few, 3 problems or something, if I remember right. So that fit well with having the extra need for you to get the midterm done this week. So I felt it was good to go a little lighter on the homework to give you some time to spend on the test. I've been concerned from the beginning about the level and the volume of work that you have to digest each week here, but I don't know how else you do it in 7 weeks.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, let me just give you, and I've posted these notes if you've seen them or not. Just give you some highlights of chapter 13. This chapter is called Risk, Cost of Capital, and Valuation. And as I probably said before, this particular book tends to roll things together in chapters that are usually treated separately, and it's true in this case as well. But the concept behind this chapter is to introduce the basic relationships between risk and the cost of various forms of capital. And keep in mind that when we talk about sources of capital, where generically you're talking about common equity, that is common stock equity, debt, borrowed funds, and in some cases preferred stock, although preferred stock isn't used a lot by very many companies. So when we talk about the relationships between risk and capital costs, you're really talking about how do these different classes of capital differ in their risk characteristics, and therefore the level of return that investors in them expect to be able to earn consistent with the level of risk they're being asked to take. So just key concepts in this chapter are, first of all, what is equity capital? How is it distinguished from debt? The fact that equity capital, from a legal perspective, includes both preferred and common stock. But generally, when we talk about equity, we're normally using it as shorthand to refer to common stock equity. Equity, of course, has certain characteristics associated with it. It's an ownership position. So preferred stock, technically, from a legal perspective, is an ownership asset. But preferred stock has characteristics of both debt and equity. So it's generally viewed as a hybrid type of capital. One key thing is, as indicated here, how do retained earnings fit into the picture? It's very important that you recognize that retained earnings belong to common stockholders. The retained earnings that a company year by year plows back into the business and reinvests in the company is money they're investing on behalf of common stockholders. And so when you're trying to estimate how much is the total common stockholder equity in a company, you must include the retained earnings along with the paid-in capital that shareholders made at the time the stock was issued. On the other hand, when you look at equity from a market value perspective, the market value of equity is the market's assessment of what those balance sheet items are worth. What I'm saying is you can go to the balance sheet and see the common stock equity on a historical basis that's been put there by proceeds from the sales of stock plus retained earnings over the years that the company has plowed back into the firm. The market looks and says, okay, what are those claims worth in market value today? And so the market value encompasses both the retained earnings and the paid-in capital. Chapter introduces the term leverage, and it's important to understand what leverage is. It refers to the use of fixed costs. We normally think of leverage as financial leverage, meaning we're using fixed cost financing. Fixed cost financing includes primarily debt, but technically also would include preferred stock, because the term fixed cost means there's a specific amount of commitment, financial commitment, that the company makes to service those forms of capital each year. We also, and I think this chapter introduces or discusses it, there's also something called operating leverage. And operating leverage has to do with fixed costs that are not financial in nature, but operating in nature. And it means it's referring to fixed costs that occur on the income statement above the operating income line. So the easiest way to think about it is you have two companies, one of which is all labor driven. It's everything is done by workers, and they have only minimal tools, therefore minimal capital investment. Another company has a high degree of automation, very few workers, everything's being done by robots and machines and computers. The latter company has a lot of fixed costs. They've invested capital in putting the equipment in place. They've got costs to keep, to keep them operating. Whereas the first company can lay people off. If demand goes down, they quickly cut the workforce or cut their hours, and costs are generally highly variable. So when we talk about a firm that uses a high degree of operating leverage, we're talking about firms that have a lot of fixed costs built into their cost structure above the EBIT line or operating income line on the income statement. Contrast that with financial leverage, which refers to fixed cost financing, which shows up below the EBIT line, primarily in interest costs. But the effect of leverage, whether it's operating or financial, is similar. It tends to magnify the inherent risk of the business. You take the risk that's inherent in uncertainty over how much you can sell and at what price you can sell your products. When you add leverage, you are going to make the variability of your bottom line greater than it would be if you didn't have the leverage. And again, draw an analogy to us as individuals, our personal lives. If you got a lot of debt, you get 2 car payments and your mortgage and a second mortgage and all those things, obviously you become a lot more risky as a prospective borrower for additional money. So a borrower or a bank is going to look at what do you already have on your lineup of costs that are fixed and must be met each month before they'll decide whether they're going to give you more debt. So that's that's the concept of leverage in a personal sense. Questions? No? Okay. Chapter also discusses the use of the capital asset pricing model, which we've introduced already, to find the cost of equity capital. Remember, in this chapter, we're working toward understanding what money costs a company to procure, to use. Companies use other people's money, and commonly referred to as capital. The question is, what is the market expecting in a way of return on that capital? The market's expectation becomes the cost of that capital. So when we're talking about the cost of common stock equity, we typically might look to use the capital asset pricing model. And of course, that requires that we know 3 things going forward. We need to know the risk-free rate, we need to know the market risk premium, and the beta of the specific company stock. I think this chapter does a pretty decent job, at least I felt it was, compared to what I've seen in other books, in discussing the relationship of a stock's beta to the amount of financial leverage being employed. The bottom line is that increasing financial leverage will increase the beta of the stock. It will leverage up or multiply the beta of a stock to reflect the fact that there's fewer dollars of common stock equity at work in a company that uses a lot of debt. Of course, typically you can think of it as replacing equity capital with debt capital. So you end up adding more debt, reducing the amount of equity you would have, and therefore the remaining equity becomes more risky because most of the risk is going to be borne by the common stockholders. So, if you're ever looking through a list of companies' estimated betas and you see some that look funny, you say, well, gee, I wouldn't think that business would be that risky or that sensitive to what's happening in the economy. Sometimes the explanation for it is that they use a lot of debt and they basically make themselves more risky. Of course, the goal isn't to make yourself more risky. The goal is to get to a lower cost of capital. The reason companies use debt rather than equity is that equity is expensive money. Debt, on an after-tax basis especially, is relatively cheap money. So the question is to find the balance of where's the optimal mix of debt and equity, and that's what we're going to get into in some, I think, the week after this in the capital structure decision. So it's important to recognize that debt enjoys tax deductibility. Interest payments are treated as a business cost in our tax system. So companies get to deduct interest payments. They don't get to deduct dividends paid to common stockholders nor to preferred stockholders. And that drives down the after-tax cost of debt even further and makes it particularly attractive to use in a company's pursuit of the lowest possible cost of capital. Somewhere in this chapter, and I forget exactly where it's introduced, but the overall formula for the cost of capital, it's a very simple relationship. It's, again, one of these weighted average concepts. You take the weighted average of the cost of each source of capital you use and roll it up into an overall weighted average cost of capital for the firm. I'm trying to find the formula here. Yeah, it's on page 417 in section 13.8. We calculate the weighted average cost of capital by taking the proportion of total long-term capital that comes in the form of debt and plus the proportion that comes in the form of equity, and you multiply each of those weights by the cost of those types of capital to give you an overall weighted average cost of capital. So it's important both to understand the concept of what we're doing there as well as to understand the application of the formulas. That formula, they don't have a formula number on it, but right there on page 417 is our average cost of capital. That's 13.5 actually is probably the better representation because it includes the tax deductibility factor for debt. You look at 13.5 at the bottom of page 417, you see that we multiply the before tax cost of debt, that is R sub S, by 1 minus the corporate tax rate to get the after-tax cost of debt. So, and the last comment I would make, I guess, is that these weighting factors you see in that formula, if you have your book, that S and B values that are part of the weighted average cost of capital formula, we generally prefer to have those based on the market value of debt and the market value of equity as opposed to the book values. But there's basically two ways to calculate weighted average cost of capital. One is on a book value basis using balance sheet data, and the other is using market values where you would, for example, for stocks, and I think I covered this in the video lecture, you would simply take the total value of all the common stock outstanding in the company. That would be S, capital S. We commonly call that the market cap. And bond, the debt, you know, in these concepts, it's pretty easy to think about, well, the market value of debt. For most companies, of course, the market value of debt may be a little messy to get to because they may use a combination of bonds, publicly traded bonds, plus lines of credit that they have open with financial institutions, and really you'd have to roll up an estimate of the total market value of all of those sources of debt in order to come up with the proper estimate of this variable B. Later in this chapter, it gets into an estimate of the value of the firm. This is page 419 and beyond. The value of the firm, you can think about the value of the company as just being the discounted present value of future cash flows, where those cash flows are what this book calls the cash flow from assets. or is more commonly referred to in finance as free cash flow. So the value of the total business enterprise is simply the discounted value of future cash flows that the business is expected to generate. So the principle of valuation is pretty much the same, no whether you're talking about stocks, bonds, or a total company. The key is when you're valuing a company this way, calculating the present value of future cash flows, you discount them using the weighted average cost of capital. Weighted average cost of capital. It's always important in finance to apply the appropriate discount rate, appropriate established by what is it that you're discounting. In this case, we're discounting free cash flow from assets that belong to all suppliers of capital, both the equity suppliers and the debt suppliers. So you can calculate the value of the total business, and then in order to get back to what is the equity worth, you strip away the value of the debt claims outstanding and preferred stock claims outstanding, if there's any. So if you see on my notes, I've written it as the value of the company, V sub C, is the present value of the cash flows. The value of the stock is the total value of the company less the value that we have to assign to the debt and the preferred stock, if any preferred stock is being used. So the value of the equity is the residual, what's left over after you've recognized or accounted for the value of those other claims. Is that at all clear? I mean, you think about the total market value of the company, or what we sometimes call the enterprise value. Think of a company as a cash generating machine. It spins off cash every quarter, every year. What market should be willing to pay to have rights to those cash flows is simply the present value of them, discounted back at an appropriate rate, which in this case is our weighted average cost of capital. We can then, carve up the total enterprise value by carving out the piece that we know belongs to or represents the claims of the debt holders, similar for the preferred stockholders. What's left over, or the residual, is what will fall down to common stockholders. Does that conceptual view make any sense?
I'll have to noodle that over. I have to think about it.
Yeah, and again, I think this is addressed in the video lectures as well. Another point relative to weighted average cost of capital. A company calculates its cost of capital. It's important to know that. It's always important to know the cost of everything that you use in your business, whether it's labor or energy or anything else. Capital is a major cost of doing business for most companies. But the key point is to recognize that the overall corporate cost of capital may not be the right standard to use for evaluating investments in every division of the company. Good practice financially is to differentiate the cost of capital for each major line of business that the company has within its portfolio. And so well-run companies will customize or prepare division-specific costs of capital for each major business in its portfolio. Because, I think the book might go through some examples of this. If you don't do that, you can inappropriately load up on high-risk investments that you make because you deceive yourself into thinking that the returns from those investments are well in excess of your cost of capital. Well, they're well in excess of your weighted average corporate cost of capital, but they're not well in excess of what rates ought to be for those riskier investments that occur in that particular business unit. So just wanted to highlight that for you so that you recognize that it also applies to a principle that a company can't use its cost of capital as the investment standard for an investment to be made outside of its line of business. If a company is considering an acquisition of a business that's fundamentally different from what they're doing now, they need to spend time to develop an appropriate cost of capital, or what we'll call hurdle rate, to use for that line of business, because otherwise you're discounting cash flows at an inappropriate rate. And again, this term hurdle rate that I've used already is the term commonly applied to the standard that an investment must meet or exceed within a business in order to be a candidate to be funded or financed. The hurdle rate, as the name implies, is an investment must provide at least a minimum rate of return equal to the hurdle rate, or otherwise it's a negative net present value investment, and we don't want to be making negative net present value investments. The last key terminology item I had in this list was capital structure. And all capital structure refers to, and again, we're going to deal with this more, I think, in chapter 16 and 17, is the mix of debt and equity, or the mix of sources of capital that a company chooses to use to finance itself. We're talking about long-term capital. So if you look at the balance sheet, look at the right-hand side of the balance sheet below the current liabilities level. That's where all of the sources of long-term capital will appear. And the company has to make a decision about what its capital structure is going to be long-term. And we call that, the target capital structure. And the way the company goes about making that decision is by making assessments of where the lowest overall weighted average cost of capital is to be found. We said equity capital, common equity, is expensive. Debt capital, on an after-tax basis especially, is pretty cheap. So how do we go about blending those two sources of capital to end up with the lowest overall weighted average cost of capital? That's what chapters 16 and 17 are going to deal with. But you can think about it again from a personal perspective. Well, equity capital is expensive. Equity capital is, maybe your savings. That's what you worked hard to put in place. It's easy to go out and borrow money, and the borrowing rate may look attractive, especially in today's market. Go buy a new car and finance it for 2 or 3%. But you know that if you do too much of that borrowing, what's going to happen? That 2 or 3% money is going to disappear, and people are going to start to demand higher rates from you because they view you as a poor credit risk. So companies have to do the same thing. They say, well, given our line of business, how much debt will the markets be comfortable with us using, and still be confident that we won't have any trouble paying our interest expense and paying our debt holders as promised, before they start driving up the cost of those borrowed funds. And of course, the cost of equity capital, as we said before, as you use more and more debt, you're in essence displacing common equity, because we assume that, the company needs $100 million of capital in total. Should it use 90% debt money and 10% equity money, or the other way around? And of course, at the extremes, we can assume if we're only using 10% debt, the debt's probably going to be cheap. If we're trying to use 90% debt, that debt's going to start to get pretty expensive, because people recognize you're now a riskier enterprise than you would have been if you had 90% common equity, which has no firm repayment obligations associated with it. Any questions on that? Again, probably that question is better asked after you've spent this week mulling over this particular material, but some important concepts embodied in Chapter 13. So it's another one of those fairly heavy-duty ones. Chapter 15, on the other hand, as I said, it's called long-term financing. It's really just a sort of an overview chapter on what choices does a company have. Again, some of the same issues that we discussed in my highlighting here of Chapter 13. Talks again about the difference in different types of securities, equity securities, preferred stock and common stock. Talks about the features of equity, including voting rights, which of course mainly apply to common stockholders. Preferred stockholders normally don't have voting rights. And by voting rights, we're talking about, first and foremost, selecting the board of directors to represent you, but also any other issues that are brought to shareholders for voting by the management. Voting rights generally are limited to common stockholders. Some companies use multiple classes of common stock. It's typical that companies only have one class of common stock, but some will have multiple classes, usually not more than two. But sometimes what happens is that a company gets started and is founded by an individual or a family. I think back to, you may not remember them, but remember the early pioneers in word processing, Lang Labs? You ever hear of Lang Labs out of Massachusetts? They were the original word processing company in terms of the hardware and software. They really pioneered back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s a lot of business calculation equipment and technology, as well as then eventually word processing. Lang Labs was founded by a Chinese family, and from up in Massachusetts. And Wang, when they went public with a Class B stock. A Class A stock was held by the founders, and it's called, sometimes called founder stock. So the parent, the founding family, preserved a lion's share of the voting rights, even though they ended up raising a lot of capital through the issue of Class B shares. So if you run across a company where you see Class A, Class B, it's because there's basically two different varieties of common stock that have been issued, and typically they'll differ with regard to voting rights, how many votes go to each share, and also payment of dividends. There may be different dividend payments being made for the different classes of stock. It's important to recognize that preferred stock dividends are not tax deductible. You have to make preferred stock dividend payments out of after-tax monies, just as you do for common stock dividends. Of course, moving on to debt sources of capital, we spend in Chapter 8, I guess, some time talking about debt capital, in particular bonds, the publicly traded variety of debt capital. And, there's a variety, there's a variety of ways to characterize the yields on debt, in particular bonds, debt in the form of bonds. And it's important here, again, that you understand, what do we mean by yield to maturity? What is the yield to maturity of a bond? Ideally, by now, you have a pretty well established concept of what yield to maturity is. If not, you probably maybe go back to Chapter 8 and review that. But yield to maturity is the compound annual rate of return that an investor in a bond will earn or will realize if they buy at current price and hold that bond until it matures, collecting all of the interest payments and the principal payment at maturity. That's the yield to maturity. It's important to recognize the yield to maturity is set by the market. It's not something the company sets. It's not fixed for the life of the bond. The yield to maturity changes as the price of the bond changes. Because if you go back to that definition of yield to maturity that I just recited, I said if you buy at the current price and hold until maturity. The cash flows you're going to receive from the bond, of course, are fixed. The coupon rate is fixed and the principal is fixed. So the cash flows you'll get are fixed usually over the life of the bond. What changes is the price that you can buy that asset at, the market price of the bond. So the yield to maturity ties to that market price, and therefore you can view the yield to maturity to be a market established rate. Of course, this chapter also points out that many companies aren't big enough to use publicly traded bonds. They don't have a large enough need for debt capital to justify going to the capital markets with those tradable securities, and they will establish lines of credit, borrowings from financial institutions, banks, other forms of financial institutions, including insurance companies and so forth. This discussion in this chapter of debt sources talks about zero coupon bonds. I think we touched upon those in chapter 8 as well. Zero coupon bonds being bonds that don't pay any intermediate interest payments. Your return for investing in a zero coupon bond is entirely made up of the difference between the price you buy it at and the price it pays you at maturity. So a zero coupon bond will always sell for less than its maturity value, as long as there's a positive rate of interest. So it just, the valuation of zero coupon bonds is pretty simple. It's the discounted value of the maturity payment, present value of the maturity payment. I think I noted, we'll discuss chapter 8, the fact that from a tax point of view, though, zero coupon bonds, even though you receive no cash, you do have to pay income tax on the imputed interest. Did we discuss that?
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds familiar.
Yeah, okay. I thought I had. Okay. Among some of the terminology introduced in this chapter, of course, it talks about, when it's discussing debt, it talks about the contract that sort of captures all of the elements of the bond. We call that the indenture. And within the indenture, you'll find protective covenants. That's another term. Protective covenants are provisions built into the indenture to protect the investors in this debt. Make sure the company doesn't do anything sneaky to inappropriately reduce the value of the company and thereby deprive creditors of what they're owed. So indentures will contain constraints typically on what the company can do in managing itself, constraints on when it can pay dividends to common stockholders, how much liquidity or what its cash balance must be. And the less creditworthy you are as a company, the more onerous the protective covenants will be contained in the indenture. But the indenture, as you can imagine, is a big legal document that basically establishes a contract between borrower and lender, and it establishes the rules of the game for the particular debt issue. You should be familiar with subordination, the term subordination. What does it mean in the context of debt? And of course, what it means, it refers to, is the fact that companies may have a variety of bonds outstanding at a given time, and you have to establish a pecking order. Who has the most senior claim in the case the company gets in trouble? Who's first in line? And subordination basically designates that some of the debt holders have agreed to be further back in line in terms of their claims against the cash and assets of the company if the company gets into trouble. The term syndication is also introduced here, and it's really used in two different contexts. One, syndication, syndicate, formation of the syndicate is often done when companies are borrowing large amounts of money from banks. The banks may deem that it's prudent for them to divide up the that debt among several banks, so they may syndicate a loan. There may be a group of banks that actually extend the credit to the company. The other place where you heard the term syndicate used is when the investment banks are issuing debt, or a debt in particular. They may team up with other investment banks, particularly bringing in some foreign investment banks to reach out to the global markets for placement of the debt. So the syndication can be either for a direct lending arrangement or for the issue of an issue of publicly traded bonds. So again, there's some discussion at the end of that chapter 15 on trends in financing, recent trends, and one of the key points being made there is that companies are becoming more and more self-financing. If you look at the sources of capital, you see that companies are generating majority of their capital needs through retained earnings. And of course, this differs from company to company. Well-established companies usually have very high cash flow. Therefore, they do generate a lot of internal financing, if you will. Younger companies typically are in need of external financing. But on average, if you look at U.S. firms, the data in the book will show you that companies are increasingly self-financing. The other thing, of course, is that companies in recent decades have been buying back common stock equity shares at a rather steady and increasing rate. So if they're issuing debt, chances are it's mainly being used to buy back shares, and some of that may be part of the company's process of moving toward their target capital structure. But an overall message, and I think I made this before, is that companies once established, public companies, seldom issue new common stock. Companies get most of their new equity capital through retained earnings. Markets don't like companies issuing new common stock after they've gone public. So it's seldom done. Sometimes it is, sometimes necessary, sometimes done as part of a major acquisition deal. But in general, markets get nervous when companies start raising new equity capital. They like to see equity capital coming from retained earnings. So those, again, are just the highlights that I've noted out of these chapters. You'll take comfort, perhaps, in the fact that I have to sit and listen to these lectures, too. Remember what it was that I said. And, of course, made a few notes along the way about, got to change that. Should say that a little differently. But I try to capture the key points that are made. I've urged you before, as you go through the video lectures or reading of the text or whatever you're doing in order to digest this material, please make notes of areas where things aren't clear. I'm more than happy in these sessions to replow ground where it needs to be addressed and help you with this, massive weekly digestion problem that you have, given the pace of this course. So please don't hesitate to bring me an assignment each week in these consultation sessions to tell me again what this means. Those kinds of questions. Okay.
Okay.
Anything else that needs to be addressed? I think the end's in sight, right? We've only got 3 more weeks after this. Oh, one thing I did want to address with you. During Thanksgiving week, I assume we don't want to try to have one of these sessions after we've all had our turkey dinner. Probably wouldn't work. But I would like to be able to have a session during that week. So I'm flexible. I could do, I would expect that Wednesday night wouldn't be a good night either. People are getting ready for the holiday, although if that's what the consensus would be, I think I can do Wednesday night. I could do Friday during the day sometime. Many people are off not working that day. I can consider doing something on Friday. And the last slot I guess I would offer up would be a Saturday morning for that particular week. So
well, I'd be fine with Wednesday because I'm going away that weekend.
Okay.
And I have activities scheduled. But if it's, if it can't be Wednesday night and it has to be sometime over the weekend, if I'm available and not,
Okay.
at a
All right.
at a scheduled thing, I'll be there.
Okay. Well, I'll have to solicit Emma's perspective on this, but beyond that, it's up to the 4 of us to decide what works. So if you don't have any immediate thoughts right now, fire me an email.
Wednesday night works for me.
Does it? Okay.
Yeah, that'll be fine with me.
Oh, well, then let me bounce that off of Emma. See if, and again, she's participated in maybe half the time in these things anyway, but I'd like to try to find a time slot where she can participate. So good. If it has to be Wednesday, that's fine. Again, I don't think I've got anything major going. I was a little concerned that I would be in a panic when I got back from California to get my boat winterized, but the boat sale closed today, so I'm now
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
I'm now without a money pit. So well, yeah, it wasn't a great deal, but getting it behind us, and as I said, if the deal hadn't come together and gone through, then I would have been scrambling when I got back, because obviously with snow falling, you should have the winterization done before now, and I would have if we hadn't had this prospect of the deal. So anyway, that week of Thanksgiving, it will be pretty open for me. I'll be relaxing after what I'm sure is a little bit of a tiring trip, especially with I got 4 grandsons I'm going to be visiting out there.
Oh, wow.
There's two in each location, so we'll be as I might have said before, one of them in Northern California is one I haven't met in person yet. He was just born 2 months ago, and
Oh, wow.
the other 2, well, and then he's got a brother who's turning 2 next week, and then the other 2 down in Bakersfield are a little older. There's let's see, he's what? There's an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old down there. So yeah, I don't get to see him very often. That's I had to try to pick a time, and ideally I wouldn't have done it in the middle of this class, but I thought, well, with this day and age, I can at least do these kinds of things from on the road. And, we can get our trip in. So anyway, if that's it, I'll be in touch with you. And again, don't send me your case. Don't forget the
Before we sign off,
Yeah.
I got this weird, and maybe Maureen, you might know something about this. On my Blackboard, I got a bunch of like week 4, week 3, week 2 homework submissions overdue. And I know I turned them in because
That's just a notification.
okay, I never saw those before that they came in overdue because I thought that once you uploaded them, then that went away. So it was kind of weird that all of a sudden these things popped into on my Blackboard
No,
this week.
I think that's just that's nothing that you have to be concerned about.
Okay.
I think that's
All
just a generalized notification.
Okay, all right, good.
I wasn't. Well, maybe it was something I was doing wrong, but okay. All right. Well, yeah, you guys have been doing good on getting things in. And as I said, if you need an extra day on an assignment or something, I'm not going to be a stickler about it because I know you and you guys in particular being very conscientious about getting things in, as has Emma. Although hers comes in at like 2:00 in the morning because it's for her it's 11 o'clock at night, so it's in ahead of the deadline. But that's fine. I understand. All right. Okay. Well, have a good evening. I'm going to see if I have to shovel snow yet, but hopefully.
Yeah, well, have a good trip.
Yeah, thank you. It's going to be I'm not looking forward to the flights. I look forward to being there, but not to getting there. So it's going to be a challenge. I get, I used to fly and travel so much in my work all over the world. And when I got away from that, I retired. I have no inclination to travel at all, especially by air. So I avoid airplanes at all costs, except when it's no other choice like this one. So anyway, again, have a good evening, and we'll see you next week, and be in touch during the week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.